I'm Ronna Berger. I'm in the philosophy department, and I'm here tonight as director of the Geisman Chair of Judeo-Christian Studies. And we are especially indebted tonight to the Mariana and Rabbi Julian Feibelman Memorial Lecture. Professor Batnitzky is a devoted teacher, a productive, distinguished scholar. She's the co-editor of the Jewish Studies Quarterly and of a monograph series on Jewish thought and philosophy. Somehow she manages at the same time to be the director of the Tikva Project on Jewish thought at Princeton, which has been supporting some wonderful educational and scholarly activities. Professor Batnitzky's background began with a BA in philosophy from Barnard College and a BA in Bible from Jewish Theological Seminary. After spending a year in the Antioch International Buddhist Studies program, I'm finding out a little bit about how that fits in. She took up graduate studies in religion at Princeton. Apparently, Princeton couldn't let go of her after she completed her PhD in 1996. She began teaching there the following year and has been doing so ever since. Amongst many other honors, she is a recipient of the Princeton President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. Many awards and fellowships testify to the quality of Professor Batnitzky's scholarly work. Her research interests cover a broad range, but all of its elements seem to be integrally connected. Philosophy of religion, modern Jewish thought, hermeneutics, contemporary legal and political theory. She's the author of numerous articles and several important books, including studies of thinkers like Franz Rosenzweig, Leo Strauss, and Emmanuel Levinas. Her most recent book, available on Amazon.com, How Judaism Became a Religion, an Introduction to Modern Jewish Thought, emerged from many years of teaching and is now, not surprisingly, drawing much attention and interest. I expect some of the issues in that book will be addressed in the talk this evening. Private faith, public religion, tensions in modern Jewish thought. We are fortunate to have the opportunity to hear her reflections on this important theme, and I hope we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. Please join me in welcoming Leora Batnitzky.
In the last few decades, theorists of religion and anthropologists have increasingly noted that the characterization of religion as a private experience is a very modern European and particularly Protestant one. More recently, some scholars and political commentators have highlighted the tension between this modern concept of religion as private experience and the centrality of law in Islam, which is concerned not with private internal experience, but public external standards of behavior. Some have even gone so far as to suggest that this difference represents an ultimate clash of civilizations whose ramifications are being played out in the violence of contemporary global politics. At the same time, even if we confine our discussion just to the United States and just to Christians in the United States, there can be no doubt that the question of whether religion is a private or public matter is at the forefront of debates about contemporary American political identity. Maybe it'll even come up tonight in the presidential debates. We don't know, since here we are. Okay, but you see it's connected, of course, to those debates. But this very contemporary issue is much, much older than it might seem from current debates. Ever since the Enlightenment, Jewish thinkers have debated whether and how Judaism, largely a religion of practice and public adherence to law, can fit into this modern Protestant conception of religion as an individual and private matter of belief or faith. It is this clash between the modern category of Judaism and this, not the modern category of Judaism, we'll get to that, this modern category of religion and Judaism, the clash between private faith and public religion, that, I will suggest, is responsible for much of the creative tension in modern Jewish thought. Before turning to this tension, let me briefly define how I'm using the term religion. A recent op-ed contributor to the New York Times captured this modern Protestant notion of religion very succinctly when he wrote, quote, "Religion and politics, though often spoken about in the same breath, are of course fundamentally different. Politics is by definition a public activity. Though religion contains large public components, it is at core a personal affair. It is the relationship we have with ourselves, or, as the British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said, what the individual does with his solitariness," end quote. So this is the idea of religion that I'm going to be referring to when I use the word religion. Now, in what follows, I want to say I'm less concerned with how various modern Jewish thinkers themselves use the word religion. I'm not so worried about whether they use the word or not to describe Judaism. I'm more interested in whether their conceptions of Judaism are best explained by this modern category of religion, the one just defined by Whitehead as the individual and what the individual does with his solitariness. Three interrelated aspects of this modern concept of religion are especially relevant. First, the notion that Judaism is a religion, again in this modern sense, suggests that Judaism is something different in kind from the supreme political authority of the sovereign state, though Judaism as a religion may in fact complement the sovereign state. But they're different kinds of things. Second, the modern concept of religion suggests that religion is one particular dimension of life among other particular and separate dimensions of life, such as politics, morality, science, or economics. Understood as such, religion may or may not have political, moral, scientific, or economic implications, but religion is nonetheless to be distinguished from other spheres of human life. And third, individual conviction and voluntary association are central to this modern concept of religion. A number of thinkers to whom I'll soon turn reject the term religion as applied to Judaism because of its Protestant associations. However, we will see, or I will argue, that despite their protestations to the contrary, these thinkers nevertheless inadvertently describe Judaism as a modern religion in a Protestant sense, because their claims about Judaism are predicated on one or more of the three aspects of the modern concept of religion that I just mentioned. After making the case for the inextricable tie between modern Jewish thought and this vexed notion of Jewish religion, I will turn in the conclusion of my paper to consider why any of this matters. Okay. So, to appreciate the novelty of the idea of Jewish religion, let me just outline very briefly the most basic facts about the structure and nature of the medieval and early modern Jewish community. Some of you may well be familiar with this, but I'm just going to give some of the basics. So prior to modernity, which I define here simply as the acquisition of the rights of citizenship for Jews, Judaism was not a religion, and Jewishness was not a matter of culture or nationality. Rather, Judaism and Jewishness were all of these things at the same time: religion, culture, and nationality. The basic framework of organized Jewish life in the medieval and early modern periods was the local Jewish community, which was an autonomous legal body that had jurisdiction over the Jewish population in a particular area. While a local Jewish community's existence depended on the whim of others, meaning the nobility or whoever was in charge, pre-modern Jewish communities also had a tremendous amount of political autonomy. For the most part, Jewish communities were self-governing, and they were answerable mainly to themselves. Local Jewish communities often varied greatly from one another. Yet, despite local differences, pre-modern Jews imagined themselves as one united people, as Klal Yisrael, the collective people of Israel. Rabbis and scholars engaged one another on matters of Jewish law or thought across communities. Many economic activities occurred across communities, and perhaps most significantly, Jewish communities often came to each other's aid in times of need by providing money to help communities, for instance, that had been rampaged by violent riots, or even to come and help pay for the ransom of Jewish captives. On a theological level, Jews had a common messianic hope that all of the Jewish communities dispersed around the world would be reunited in the land of Israel in the days of the Messiah. So let's now turn to how that framework turned into a very different kind of framework in which Judaism is now conceived of as a religion, again in the modern sense that I mentioned. So like most topics in modern Jewish thought, our story begins, of course, with Spinoza. And as many of you know, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656. Now, this is interesting for many, many reasons, but one reason is because, on the one hand, the fact of Spinoza's excommunication shows us that the pre-modern Jewish community did have political power. They could excommunicate people. Yet his refusal to convert to Christianity, and this is the most important part, his ability to live an independent life free of any religious community, to the dismay of both the Jewish and Calvinist communities of Amsterdam, undercut the power of the Jewish community. In this way, Spinoza also anticipates Jewish modernity, in which the Jewish community does not exercise political power over individual Jews. In his theologico-political treatise, published anonymously, Spinoza made an argument about Jewish law to which many modern Jewish thinkers later responded. In an attempt to raise doubts about the truth of revealed religion generally, Spinoza was particularly critical of any notion of religious law that supported the idea of a personal, supernatural God who communicates his will to people. To discredit this understanding of religious law, Spinoza contended that the laws of the Hebrews, that is, the Jews, were pertinent only in the context of their original political meaning. Quote, ceremonial observances form no part of the divine law and had nothing to do with blessedness and virtue, but had reference only to the elections of the Hebrews, that in their temporal bodily happiness and the tranquility of their kingdom, and therefore they were only valid while that kingdom lasted, end quote. Because the ceremonial law, according to Spinoza, no longer corresponds to a political kingdom, he concludes that Jewish law is, first of all, not divine law, and second of all, that post-biblical law is meaningless. So any kind of Jewish law in the post-biblical period, according to Spinoza, has no real meaning. Now, as he knew full well, and as Spinoza's excommunication showed, Jewish law did not disappear in the post-biblical period. In fact, what we call Judaism and Jewish law today, as I'm sure many of you know, developed post-biblically. Jewish law and Judaism were, however, useful targets for Spinoza, since criticizing them would not offend his Christian readers, but would allow his more philosophical readers to draw for themselves the implications of his arguments. Spinoza, who followed Thomas Hobbes in this way, anticipated and hoped for a time when a unified sovereign state would be the only type of political authority. Within just 2 centuries, much of Spinoza's vision would come to pass, and it is in this context of the emergence of the modern nation state that Moses Mendelssohn would actually invent the idea that Judaism is a religion in this modern sense. Now, Mendelssohn followed Spinoza in maintaining that the ceremonial law makes no claims on philosophy or politics, but he denied against Spinoza that after the destruction of the Second Temple, the meaning of the Jewish ceremonial law could only be political and therefore meaningless. As Mendelssohn put it in his public defense of Judaism in Jerusalem, quote, Judaism boasts no exclusive revelation of eternal truths. The voice which let itself be heard on Sinai on that great day did not proclaim, I am the eternal, your God, the necessary independent being, omnipotent and omniscient, that recompenses men in a future life according to their deeds. This, Mendelssohn says, is the universal religion of mankind, not of Judaism. In contrast to the universal religion of mankind, which he equates with morality, Judaism, Mendelssohn contends, is a historical, temporal truth that makes demands only on the Jewish people and not on society and morality at large. In making a distinction between the universal religion of mankind and Judaism, Mendelssohn distinguishes between the laws of the state that, by definition, may demand adherence, and the realm of Jewish society that he claims makes no such demands. Now, both in the context of Jerusalem, the text in which Mendelssohn makes these arguments, and in the context of the Jewish tradition as it has historically been practiced, this distinction is particularly ironic and telling. After all, in defending Judaism to his Christian critics, Mendelssohn claims, quote, Judaism knows of no revealed religion in the sense in which Christians understand this term. The Israelites possess a divine legislation, laws, commandments, ordinances, rules of life, instruction in the will of God as to how they should conduct themselves in order to attain temporal and eternal felicity, end quote. So, on the one hand, Mendelssohn claims that Judaism is not a religion because Judaism demands action, not belief. This is where, for Mendelssohn, it differs from Christianity. But, on the other hand, Mendelssohn defines Jewish law in completely apolitical terms. That is, precisely in contrast to the laws of the state. As he puts it, quote, Judaism as religion knows of no punishment, no other penalty than the one the remorseful sinner voluntarily imposes on himself. It knows of no coercion, uses only the staff called gentleness, and affects only mind and heart, end quote. Now, very fundamentally, Mendelssohn's definition and description of Judaism is at odds with itself. Judaism is not a religion in the way that his Lutheran interlocutors had understood religion, that is, in terms of faith, because Judaism is a religion of law and action. Furthermore, Mendelssohn maintains, Jewish law is not a deadening legalism, as some Protestant caricatures would have it, but what he calls a living script. For these reasons, Mendelssohn would seem to reject the liberal definition of religion offered by his younger contemporary, Friedrich Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher is, I think, probably the most important theologian of what we would call today liberal Protestantism. Okay? Now, this is how Schleiermacher, in a book called On Religion Defenses to its Culture Despisers, this is how Schleiermacher defines religion. Quote, religion's essence is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. End quote. For Mendelssohn, the revealed legislation of Judaism, as opposed to Schleiermacher's liberal faith, is oriented toward both thinking and acting. In his words, quote, among all the prescriptions and ordinances of the Mosaic law, there is not a single one which says, you shall believe or not believe. They all say, you shall do or not do. The ceremonial law is a kind of living script, rousing the mind and heart, full of meaning, never ceasing to inspire contemplation and to provide the occasion and opportunity for oral instruction, end quote. Yet along with this rejection of the boundaries placed on the concept of religion by Protestants during the Enlightenment, Mendelssohn also removes any conflict between Judaism and universal truth, and he calls universal truth the universal religion of mankind, and also any conflict between Judaism and the state, by claiming in both cases that any conflict would seem to arise just as a result of a category error. They're just fundamentally different. Judaism is distinct from and not a threat to universal truth, just as Judaism, and indeed Jewish law, is distinct from and not a threat to the state. From a formal perspective, then, if not from the perspective of content, Mendelssohn's definition of Judaism does actually fit very much with Schleiermacher's liberal Protestant definition. As Schleiermacher puts it, quote, religion maintains its own sphere and its own character only by completely removing itself from the sphere and character of speculation as well as from that of practice, end quote. So Mendelssohn wants to have it both ways. Judaism is a religion requiring action and stimulating contemplation, yet when it comes to questions of universal action, state law, for instance, and when it comes to universal contemplation, the truths of philosophy, Judaism, Mendelssohn argues, remains separate and dispensable, except insofar as Judaism calls for obedience to the state's laws. To apply Schleiermacher's words to Mendelssohn, we could say that for Mendelssohn, and this is me applying the words, he doesn't actually say this, Jewish law maintains its own sphere and its own character only by completely removing itself from the sphere and character of universal speculation, as well as from that of universal praxis. Like Schleiermacher's, Mendelssohn's project is apologetic and protective. As the subtitle of his book, On Religion, Speeches to Its Culture Despisers, suggests, Schleiermacher attempts to separate religion from other dimensions of human life in order to save religion from criticism, whether philosophical, moral, or political. So basically he's saying you can't criticize religion from a philosophical, moral, or political point of view because religion is something different from philosophy, morality, and politics. In Mendelssohn's case, as we know, he was challenged either to defend Judaism publicly or to convert to Christianity, and this is the context of his defense of Judaism and its apologetic claims. He chose to defend Judaism, but he had to do so without offending his enlightened Christian audience. Given that when he writes Jerusalem, Mendelssohn and the Jewish community for whom he speaks had no civil rights whatsoever, the caution that Mendelssohn was forced to use when writing Jerusalem cannot be overstated. Nevertheless, the tension between the claims that Jewish law demands contemplation and action and the claim that Jewish law is in essence dispensable to the pursuit of universal truth and morality bears itself out in the subsequent fate of Mendelssohn's philosophy. On the one hand, Mendelssohn provides a very traditional conception of the Jewish obligation to obey the law, and this is how he puts it, quote, "He who is not born into the law need not bind himself to the law, but he who is born to the law must live according to the law and die according to the law," end quote. Yet on the other hand, Mendelssohn provides no philosophical or theological justification for why Jews should obey the law, and by virtue of his own definitions, he could not provide any philosophical or theological justifications for Jews to follow the law, because he's argued that Jewish law is a temporal historical truth whose legitimacy neither rests upon the universally accessible dimensions of philosophical truth nor upon the dogmas of particular theological belief. When the liberal society that Mendelssohn had hoped for was, at least to some extent, finally actualized, the question of why Jews should remain Jews would be one that Jews would continually ask themselves. While modern Jewish thinkers would continue to differ, and they differ a lot, about the essential meaning of Judaism, as well as about Judaism's relation to the Western philosophical tradition, virtually all German Jewish thinkers, along with many others, not just German Jewish thinkers, they would all follow Mendelssohn in defining Judaism as a religion in this way. Now, it's not surprising that Abraham Geiger, the intellectual founder of the Reform movement, equated what he claimed was Judaism's world historical essence with Judaism's role as a religion. For Geiger, Judaism's essence was what he called its universal religious element. Not only was Judaism a religion, Geiger contended, but it was also the religious genius, this is Geiger's term, that ushered the monotheistic worldview into human history. Geiger's equation of Judaism with original monotheism had a twofold implication. First, from an internal Jewish perspective, now that the shackles of historical accident had been removed, now that Jews were living in a different kind of political society, Judaism had to be reformed in keeping with its essential nature as a religion. Second, from an external point of view, the non-Jewish world, and especially the Protestant Christian world that Geiger and German Jewry inhabited, needed to recognize Judaism's contribution to world history and to Western civilization. Far from being a relic of the past, a dead relic of the past, Judaism, Geiger argued, is the living spirit from which Protestantism derives. And this is the kind of claim that almost all German Jewish thinkers would end up making in one way or another, which would be that, look, Protestants, if you like the Hebrew prophets and you think Jesus is a moral exemplar, this would be the view of liberal Protestants, actually you got all of those ideas from Judaism. And this is not an argument that only Geiger makes. It's an argument that virtually every German Jewish thinker makes, and it's very interesting for lots of reasons. One reason is that on the one hand, one could look at it, this is just hubris. But on the other hand, it tells us, I think, something very important about how much German Jews felt they had to justify the continued existence of Judaism, that they had to show that Judaism had made a contribution to Christianity and therefore to Western civilization and modern German society. So back to Geiger. For Geiger, recognition of Judaism's distinctly religious character held the key to reforming Judaism in keeping with modernity, but also to replacing the mistaken conception that modernity is intrinsically antithetical to Judaism with proper recognition of modernity's inherently Jewish character. So both Protestantism, liberal Protestantism, and modernity, Geiger argued, it all came from Judaism. Okay. Now, stressing that the history of Judaism can only be a history of what he called its spiritual achievements, because it is, quote, precisely to its independence from political status that Judaism owes its survival, end quote, Geiger linked his religious and non-political conception of Judaism with a commitment to the German national cause. Quote, the Germans were able to give birth to the greatest discoveries, to the free spirit of the Reformation, and to the glory of a literature of worldwide import, end quote. So again, Judaism had given this idea of pure monotheism, and the Germans gave us world literature and the free spirit of the Reformation, and so the marriage between the two was really quite a wonderful thing, Geiger was arguing. Now, Geiger's notion of Judaism's spiritual achievements went hand in hand with his attempt to rid the Judaism of his day of any notion of Jewish collective politics or messianic hope. Geiger rightly recognized that from the perspective of Judaism and Jewish history, only the existence of a Jewish state within a state could undermine the sovereignty of the German Reich. His claims about Judaism's spiritual achievement bear directly on his affirmation of the possibility of Jewish integration into the German state, which he understood as the privatization of Jewish religious faith within a neutral political order for Jews and Germans alike. So that part of the story is really not so surprising, that Geiger and the Reform movement argued that Judaism was a religion in this modern sense. The maybe more surprising part of the story that I turn to now is that actually the proponents of what we call today modern orthodoxy made the same argument. Samson Raphael Hirsch, the foremost intellectual proponent of what is today called Orthodox Judaism, denied exactly what Geiger had affirmed, that Judaism and Jewish law in particular was subject to historical change and that Judaism is a religion. Hirsch contended that the reformers, and Geiger especially, had attempted to transform divine revelation, an eternal metaphysical fact, into a religion created by humans that could be changed according to human whim and desire. Hirsch responded to Geiger's claim that Judaism had changed throughout history with a simple but firm declaration that Judaism and Jewish law had not changed historically. And this is Hirsch, quote, at all times and in every situation, Judaism and Jewish law were an untouchable sanctuary which must not be subjected to human judgment nor subordinated to human considerations, end quote. For Hirsch, the reformers' transformation of Judaism into a religion was equally wrong-headed, for it replaced the totality of Jewish life with a small sliver of experience. And Hirsch puts this point very eloquently. He says, quote, Judaism is not a religion. The synagogue is not a church, and the rabbi is not a priest. Judaism is not a mere adjunct to life. It comprises all of life. To be a Jew is not a mere part. It is the sum total of our task in life. To be a Jew in the synagogue and the kitchen, in the field and the warehouse, in the office and the pulpit, as father and mother, as servant and master, as man and as citizen, with one's thought in word and in deed, in enjoyment and privation, with the needle and the graving tool, with the pen and the chisel, that is what it means to be a Jew. An entire life supported by the divine idea and lived and brought to fulfillment according to the divine will, end quote. Now, somewhat ironically, despite these arguments, Hirsch's claim for the enduring authority of Jewish law was actually predicated on a deepening of Mendelssohn's and then Geiger's basic premise that Judaism is a religion. So what I'm saying is that even though Hirsch goes to great length to say Judaism is not a religion, what his arguments about Judaism actually do conform to this modern idea of religion despite what he says. Drawing on the very concepts that had usurped traditional Jewish identity and authority, Hirsch agreed with Mendelssohn in arguing that the Jewish religion is not political, but concerns only heart and mind. However, in making this claim, Mendelssohn recognized that historically the Jewish community had used its political power to coerce its members, but he contended that this coercion betrayed the true meaning of both Judaism and religion more broadly defined. The argument, in fact, was part and parcel of Mendelssohn's effort to reform the traditional Jewish community. Now, in an attempt to maintain the traditional community, Hirsch went further than Mendelssohn, claiming that the Jewish community had never been a political entity and that the traditional community existed only by virtue, quote, of those loyal to the divine law and the obligation to belong and to support to the local congregation. It was this unity of religious outlook, and that's Hirsch's phrase, within the Jewish community, and not the political life of the community, that Hirsch contended linked Jewish communal life throughout the ages. Hirsch reiterated Geiger's claim that Judaism concerned spiritual and not political matters, and that Judaism was something different in kind from the politics of the state. Quote, "Our former independent statehood did not represent the essence or the purpose of Israel's national existence, but merely a means to the fulfillment of its spiritual task," end quote. Just as Hirsch claimed that the traditional congregation was founded on individual consent, so too he emphasized that membership in the Jewish congregation was predicated on voluntary belief. Hirsch distinguished between being Jewish and what he called the genuine Jew, whose, quote, "timeless principles will move and guide him without compulsion in every fiber of his heart and every stirring of his will," end quote. Based on this argument, Hirsch petitioned for a Prussian bill that was eventually passed in 1876, allowing the Orthodox to establish a separate community by seceding from the Jewish community recognized by the state. Hirsch's implicit endorsement of a modern political order that separates church from state, or religion from politics, or makes religion private and politics public, was also an argument for Jewish sectarianism that turned Judaism into a religion based not on political identity, but on personal conviction. Now, Franz Rosenzweig is the German Jewish philosopher who perhaps did most to try to move beyond Mendelssohn's framework. As Rosenzweig remarked, quote, "From Mendelssohn on, our entire people has subjected itself to the torture of this embarrassing question. The Jewishness of every individual has squirmed on the needlepoint of why," end quote. Rosenzweig also rejected the term religion as it applied to Judaism. As he put it, quote, "God plainly did not create religion, but the world," end quote. Rosenzweig also criticized his friend Martin Buber for not being able to overcome the category of religion, despite Buber's claims to the contrary. As is well known, Buber rejected the ultimate authority of Jewish law, maintaining that law by definition befits not what he called I-thou relations, but only I-it ones. For Buber, quote, "Man, he alone speaks. And while God reveals God's self to the human being, Buber asserts that God does not reveal particular laws." Now, Rosenzweig, in contrast to Buber, affirmed the continuing authority of Jewish law. In fact, Rosenzweig suggests to Buber that without law, revelation can only be or become religion. And so this is from a letter from Rosenzweig to Buber. Quote, "What is to become of I and thou if they will have to swallow up the entire world and Creator as well? Religion. I'm afraid so, and shudder at the word whenever I hear it," end quote. Rosenzweig seems to have something in mind like Schleiermacher's definition of religion as feeling, and he's suggesting that Buber's disparaging of the I-it world, or the world of law, amounts to portioning off one aspect of human experience, what Buber calls the I-thou relation, at the expense of everything else. Again, this divvying up of human life is exactly what Schleiermacher attempted to do when he separated what he called religion from other dimensions of human life in order to save religion from criticism, whether philosophical, moral, or political. Yet Buber could have similarly charged that Rosenzweig, despite his protestation to the contrary, was also unable to overcome the modern idea that Judaism is a religion. It's true that perhaps more than any other German Jewish thinker, Rosenzweig maintained that Judaism pertained not to one dimension of human experience, but to the whole human being. As he put it, quote, "If the German Jew has prepared himself quite simply to have everything that happens to him, inwardly and outwardly, happen to him in a Jewish way, his vocation, his nationality, his marriage, and even if that has to be his Judaism, then he may be certain that with the simple assumption of that infinite pledge, he will become in reality wholly Jew, and that's holy with a W, end quote. Now, Rosenzweig, we've seen, rejected his German Jewish predecessors' confining of Judaism to a modern religion, but he nevertheless remained unable to consider the ways in which Jews as Jews, or Judaism as Judaism, might relate to modern political life. Indeed, rather than maintaining that Jewish wholeness requires a particularly Jewish involvement in politics, whatever that might mean, Rosenzweig in fact insisted, far more than his predecessors had, that Judaism qua Judaism was completely separate from politics. As Rosenzweig put it to his friend Eugen Rosenstock, quote, "It is not part of the price that the synagogue must pay for the blessing of being already in the Father's presence, that she must wear the bandages of unconsciousness over her eyes," end quote. As Rosenzweig argues at length in The Star of Redemption, the bandages of unconsciousness, which of course had been a Christian depiction of Judaism as being blind to the truth, Rosenzweig uses this image to say that the Jew is actually blind to politics and to political life. So I want to suggest that Schleiermacher's modern definition of religion is again pertinent. And I'm going to quote him again, which I've already quoted this phrase: "Religion maintains its own sphere and its own character only by completely removing itself from the sphere and character of speculation, as well as from that of praxis." Rosenzweig's understanding of Judaism fits this description because his claim is precisely that Judaism maintains its own sphere and its own character only by completely removing itself from the political life of the world around it. Like Mendelssohn, Rosenzweig describes Judaism, and particularly Jewish law, as, to use Mendelssohn's terms, a living script encompassing and guiding the whole of life for individual Jews in the Jewish community. Yet also like Mendelssohn, Rosenzweig simultaneously feels compelled to limit Judaism's living script when it comes to modern political life. So German Jewish thought ends where it began, with the tension between affirming the communal and indeed public character of Jewish life, law, and experience, while at the same time denying that this public character is in any way in conflict with the public character of the modern nation state. From Mendelssohn to Rosenzweig, German Jewish thinkers had argued that Judaism was not a religion like Protestantism because Judaism is a religion of law. Yet these same thinkers also described Judaism, often despite themselves, precisely in terms of a religion in a liberal Protestant sense, arguing that Judaism was a realm of life different in kind from all other realms of life. Now, Zionism, of course, was one response to this idea of Judaism as a religion. And a number of Zionist thinkers reflected on the tension between the Jewish tradition as it has historically been practiced and the modern concept of religion. Just to give two examples, Moses Hess argued about orthodoxy and reform. He said they shared premises, and as he put it, each of our Jewish Protestants has its own code. Nothing is more foreign to the Jewish spirit than the idea of the salvation of the individual, which, according to the modern conception, is the cornerstone of religion. Judaism has never drawn any line of separation between the individual and the family and the nation and humanity as a whole. And whether fairly or not, another Zionist thinker, the Hebrew writer Peretz Smolenskin, blamed Mendelssohn for what he regarded as the worst parts of Jewish modernity, and this is what Smolenskin said. It was Mendelssohn who doubly ensnared our people by weakening its sense of national unity and insisting on the continued total obligation of religious laws. Now, for now, I'm happy if people want to talk about it in question and answer, but I'm going to bracket Zionism, which is, of course, very diverse. And I just want to think about two Jewish immigrants to the United States who each attempted in his own way to preserve the religious elements of Judaism while rejecting the idea that Judaism is a religion in this private sense. These two thinkers are Leo Strauss and Mordecai Kaplan. The pairing of Strauss and Kaplan at first seems unlikely, both for philosophical and political reasons. Strauss, of course, became one of the most important figures in 20th century political philosophy. While he was never involved in any official way with political life, friends and foes alike have claimed Strauss as the intellectual godfather of American neoconservatism. Kaplan, in contrast, began his life as an Orthodox Jew and became the intellectual father of the only distinctly Jewish American denomination, Reconstructionist Judaism. Like Strauss, Kaplan was not officially involved in American political life, but he was active in building American Jewish institutions, and he clearly saw himself as a progressive Democrat. So those are very real differences. They're very real biographical differences, but they actually pale in comparison to their philosophical differences. Whatever Strauss's personal beliefs or politics may have been, his life's work was dedicated to the question of questioning the assumed superiority of modernity to the ancient world. In contrast, Kaplan was a champion of what he regarded as modernity's superiority to the modern world. Nevertheless, I want to suggest, despite these differences, Strauss and Kaplan both attempted in the United States, and I think that's what's significant, to reject the modern relegation of Judaism as religion, as untrue to the historical Jewish tradition, and even more importantly, as destructive to any possibility of future Jewish life. But whereas Kaplan proposed a program to ensure the future of American Judaism, Strauss believed that the most important and indeed feasible task remained the diagnosis of the problem. Strauss famously identified this problem as what he called the theologico-political predicament of modernity, in which, quote, the bond of society is universal human morality, whereas religion, positive religion, is a private affair, end quote. Among other things, this predicament reflects the tension between the modern Jewish claim that religion is a private matter and the theological political context that defined pre-modern Judaism. Mendelssohn's strained attempt to defend the necessity and centrality of Jewish law for the Jewish people, while denying that the law has any political or philosophical implications, embodies precisely this tension. As I tried to show before, the strained dynamic set in motion by Mendelssohn plays itself out not only in liberal Jewish philosophy in the German Jewish context, but also in German Jewish orthodoxy, as well as in Rosenzweig's arguably neo-Orthodox philosophy. Now, remarkably, in 1934, in his magnum opus, Judaism as a Civilization, Kaplan anticipated Strauss's 1965 analysis of the theologico-political predicament and applied it to the modern ideological movements of Judaism, which, of course, originated in Germany. And this is what Kaplan had to say about Reform Judaism. Actually, Judaism as a Civilization is a huge book. He had lots more to say than this, but in our context. Quote, only in Wonderland can there be a cat which leaves its grin behind it. In the world of reality, it is not feasible to try to have the grin without the cat. The experiment has been undertaken by Reform Judaism in trying to have the Jewish religion without the living entity to which that religion belongs, without a living, functioning Jewish people, end quote. And now this is what Kaplan had to say about modern orthodoxy. Quote, what, in short, is this law of God, which no longer regulates our workday life, and which, outside of marriage and divorce laws, functions only in matters which least affect social relationships and the adjustment of conflicting interests, end quote. Kaplan concluded his analysis of the state of contemporary Jewish life by arguing that, quote, paradoxical as it may sound, the spiritual regeneration of the Jewish people demands that religion cease to be its sole preoccupation, end quote. His proposed solution was to view Judaism not merely as a religion, but as a civilization, hence the title Judaism as Civilization, that embraces all avenues of life, including land, language, literature, mores, laws, and folkways. By viewing Judaism as a civilization, according to Kaplan, was not just a matter of adding all of these spheres back into Judaism, but it also meant, argued Kaplan, that Judaism had to rid itself of certain elements. Most famously, Kaplan contended that a rethinking, if not a disavowal, of a supernatural conception of God and any notion of Jewish chosenness was required. As he put it, quote, the modern man who is used to thinking in terms of humanity as a whole can no longer reconcile himself to the notion of any people or body of believers constituting a type of society which may be described as belonging to a supernatural order. This is essentially what the doctrine of election has hitherto implied, end quote. Now, it's here that the differences between Strauss and Kaplan emerge. While the starting points for both of their thoughts was the rejection of the German Jewish paradigm and the demand for honest and sober recognition of the break with the Jewish past that modernity brings, their evaluations of modernity for Judaism, as well as modernity itself, couldn't be more distinct. Ironically, it's Strauss, the non-believer, who emerges as the defender of the ultimate value of Jewish revelation as it has been classically understood. As he puts it in what seems to be a direct criticism of Kaplan's position, it's actually a criticism of Ahad Ha'am, the cultural Zionist, and who was a big influence on Kaplan. This is what he says, quote, "I believe by simply replacing God by the creative genius of the Jewish people, one gives away, one deprives oneself, even if one does not believe, of a source of human understanding. Now, I do not wish to minimize folk dances, Hebrew speaking, and many other things. I do not want to minimize them, but I believe that they cannot possibly take the place of what is most profound in our tradition," end quote. What is most profound for Strauss in the Jewish tradition is a belief in a transcendent God who has revealed and continues to reveal himself to the Jewish people by way of the Torah. Strauss, unlike Kaplan, provided no proposed solution to the theological political predicament. But for Strauss, this is exactly the point. There's no solution. However, it is in recognizing the irresolvable problem of Judaism's relation to the modern world that Strauss sees the relevance of Judaism and indeed of Jewish chosenness for modern political life. As he put it, quote, "Finite relative problems can be solved, infinite absolute problems cannot be solved. In other words, human beings will never create a society which is free from contradictions. From every point of view, it looks as if the Jewish people were the chosen people, at least in the sense that the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem," end quote. For Kaplan, the Jewish problem is not an absolute problem, and neither are their absolute human problems. American society, in fact, provided for Kaplan the very possibility for the simultaneous resolution of Jewish and human problems. In his words, quote, "True to his historic tradition, the American Jew should throw in his lot with all American movements to further social justice and universal peace and bring to bear upon them the inspiration of his history and religion," end quote. For Strauss, in contrast, America offered the possibility, and only the possibility, of a society and political order that would not demand or even strive for the resolution of the Jewish problem in particular, and of human problems in general. Now, despite their profound differences, Strauss and Kaplan agree that Judaism may thrive in a democratic society in which politics is the site of legitimate disagreement. So we go back to the debates for tonight. The promise of America for both Kaplan and Strauss holds the possibility of an affirmation of Jewish difference. But the meaning of Jewish difference remains unresolved for both, for perhaps opposite reasons. Kaplan famously argued for the necessity of Jewish difference, for what he called the hyphenated cultural alliance of the citizen of the modern nation state. Meaning, basically what he was saying is something we just sort of take for granted today, which is that you can be an American Jew, and that's not a contradiction in terms, just like you can be an American Catholic. And Catholicism is the relevant comparison because it's not just religious, it's cultural as well. But doesn't Kaplan's claim that Judaism is countercultural rest on the very disagreement he wants to resolve? And if Kaplan does do away with the deep sources of Jewish disagreement with the prevailing culture, as exemplified by the doctrine of election, isn't Kaplan back to exactly where Mendelssohn started? But while Kaplan may overemphasize political agreement, Strauss may overemphasize disagreement. Where are the common sources of political agreement for Strauss? If the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem, on what basis can or should Jews become good democratic citizens? Surely Jews can align themselves with democratic politics because, unlike other political orders, democracy leaves them alone. But for what reason can or should Jews acquire democratic virtues? So while Kaplan and Strauss each try to move modern Jewish thought away from this category of Jewish religion defined in terms of private faith and back to the public realm, they are left in the end with, I think, the same problem that Mendelssohn starts with, which is that how can Jewish thought or Judaism simultaneously remain loyal to the sovereign power of the modern nation state and to the Jewish tradition as it has historically been conceived? How can both go together? So, of course, tonight my purpose hasn't been to resolve this issue. Instead, what I wanted to point out is the way in which the attempt to resolve this issue is really what I think creates a real tension in modern Jewish thought, and it's a tension that produces all kinds of different answers. And it's important for a number of reasons. I'll come at the end to in 1 second to the last reason. But one reason it's also very important is just in this very brief discussion, we see that at least since, at least for 300 years, there have been discussions in modern Jewish thought about the very issue that is so important today and people think is very new, which is the role of religion in public life, whether in our national context or also in our international context. And this is why, I'm not sure if people will listen to me or not, probably not, but this is why everybody should study modern Jewish thought. Okay. All right. Okay. So I just want to conclude now and ask, in terms of thinking about modern Judaism, modern Jewish thought, why this matters. I want to suggest that looking at modern Jewish thought in terms of the question of whether Judaism is a private faith or if it's a public religion or something public, allows us, in terms of modern Judaism and in terms of modern Jewish thought, to see more unity within the tradition than is ordinarily thought. And at the same time, something I'm not discussing now, it also allows us to see how more recent thinkers have tried to break with this model. This lens permits us to expand the canon of modern Jewish thought beyond the usual suspects. For instance, viewing modern Jewish thought through this question of, is Judaism a religion, allows us to see theoreticians of Zionism and cultural Judaism as part of the same conversation about whether Judaism is a religion, and Zionists and cultural Judaism says no. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, viewing modern Jewish thought through this question of whether Judaism is a religion may allow us to better describe what kind of thinking modern Jewish thought is. Rather than viewing modern Jewish thought as primarily focused on epistemological or theological questions, it may make better sense to view modern Jewish thought and modern Jewish thinkers as answering what is first and foremost a modern political question about the place of religion in modern political liberal orders. I'm not denying that modern Jewish thinkers may have philosophical relevance beyond the question of the place of religion in the modern nation state, but what I am trying to suggest that if we are to view modern Jewish thought as somehow unified, and the modern Jewish experience, I would even argue, as somehow unified, as somehow unified, I'm suggesting that the unity comes from what is first and foremost a political question. Thank you. No, it's an excellent question. So the question is, does Mendelssohn think there's any source of authority behind the Jewish community? And I think it's an interesting question for lots of reasons. The short answer is no, there's not a source of authority behind the Jewish community. So the question is, why would he make this argument in the context of an argument for Jewish law? I think the important thing to see is that Mendelssohn could only have made this argument at one particular point in time, when Jews still didn't have political rights. So I think that for Mendelssohn, it was inconceivable that there wouldn't be Jewish communities who were together as communities. And so therefore, I think it's a problem he doesn't address. But once Jews get individual rights, this becomes the big issue, is what the community has no authority. So that's the answer. I mean, similarly, I would say Kaplan, I think, in his arguments in the 30s about Judaism, he also seems to assume that there will always be Jewish communities. And that's in the context of his attempt to respond to anti-Semitism in America. I think he thinks that there will always be anti-Semitism. And in that way, Jews will always remain parts of Jewish communities. And they do have, and he wants to say, don't hate yourselves because of this anti-Semitism. Instead, there's a lot Jews can do together and a rich tradition to draw on within these Jewish communities, but he just takes for granted that Jews will always exist in community. Thank you. Two giant questions. I guess I would say in terms of the first, I think that the two notions of privacy that you mentioned, I think where they converge is in this notion that religion is a voluntary association. So I actually think that they're not as distinct as one might think. And so I think I don't think that first scheme. I mean, I'm of course happy to talk about it longer. As far as I can see, the first scheme doesn't change anything. In terms of the second scheme, I think that part of so you said that maybe we should. Another way of looking at it is to say that really, if we understand Judaism, however it is we decide about that requires not having the disestablishment of religion. I don't think I would actually. I'll leave myself out of it. I'll say that I think that in many ways that's the religious Zionist position. And by religious Zionist, I mean here not just someone who's religious and a Zionist, but the idea that the state of Israel has some kind of theological significance. And so that is that position. Yeah. I mean, it's a historical fact, I mean, which is just true of anything, that's a new idea. It's not, yeah. On the one hand, I don't want to universalize the private public, and you're absolutely right, this reflects a Western European Jewish experience. But I'll say two things about that. There were other options, and certainly by the 19th century in the Eastern European context, arguments being made about what we today, they don't call it this, but we today would call cultural Judaism, are directly against these arguments about privatization of Judaism, and I think there are many attractive elements there. But where I would, for sure, and I think there's a lot more to be said about that, and I'm glad you asked this because I don't want to suggest this is the only way of looking at it. That said, I'm going to take that back slightly and say that I think that today this issue is I would say it is actually universal. And I think it's universal because even in the state of Israel, and that's obviously a whole other issue, the question of the religion's relationship to the state, it's very different from the U.S., obviously, but it's the defining question. And those cultural options, not just Zionist ones, but other kinds of cultural options, I think are very hard to imagine today in any kind of sustained way for lots of reasons. So I think I wasn't, by the way, trying to valorize the private side. I mean, I'm saying I wasn't trying to say that I think this is the dilemma. I mean, from my own opinion is that there were far richer resources in the Eastern European context, but as I said, it's no longer available, and at the same time, it's a good question if we assume that everything didn't end catastrophically for a moment, if we could maybe imagine that instead Jews got the rights of citizenship, I think we would have been in this. The cultural option was also only there precisely because Jews had no rights. I don't know if that's yeah. I think that's a great question. Another very minor, small question. I think what you say is really true, and I think that one of the reasons why Judaism, as it's historically been practiced, is so interesting is the way in which I think, and again, I'm sure other people have different views, but I think that the Jewish tradition fights against that. So I like the rationalist tradition in Jewish thought. I like Maimonides, but he's really an anomaly. I mean, and it's not for no reason that he was considered a great heretic. I mean, I think it's a very complicated issue because I think, and here I may be sounding far too dogmatic, but I would stand by this, and this isn't my own evaluation, it's just what I'm trying to say, that I think if one really had to say what quote-unquote Judaism is, I think it's not ultimately a choice. And I think that's the theological position. Now, of course, once one, the kind of, the Na'aseh and Ishma we will, do, and then we will hear this idea that, of course, I mean, one does, I'm not trying to suggest that there's not an element of making it your own. Let me just use that kind of language. But I think from a quote-unquote Jewish point of view, I think that is secondary to already having not chosen to be Jewish. The choosing comes after having not chosen, if that makes sense. I'm sounding very Levinasian. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great suggestion, and I should just say, a recent graduate student wrote a dissertation exactly on that in Mendelssohn, arguing that there are actually resources in Mendelssohn for thinking about this question. I mean, that said, it's a great dissertation. That said, I think, though, the real question is, well, not the real question, one of the real questions is, why in modern political orders, and this is a big generalization, but I'm going to stick by it, why in modern political orders, why it's the case that we can only understand particularity in terms of individuality. Why it's so difficult in modern political orders to accommodate the rights of minority groups. I mean, obviously this is a huge issue, but I think in some ways that's the question. I mean, you're certainly right, there's a difference. I'll just read, again, another tiny thing. Now we have the American Constitution. But, the thing I would say is I think it is absolutely an attempt to deal with that question. But I think that disestablishment, and I'm not against disestablishment, to be clear, but I think that disestablishment ultimately means that religion is a matter of voluntary association. So I would stand by, I do think it comes back to the individual. And I think, just as a side point, if you look at sort of the discussions of religion in sort of international human rights discussions, this is exactly the thing that there's always trying somehow to deal with, at the end of the day, the argument in favor of groups is ultimately, as the UN actually has said a number of times, is ultimately based upon individual conviction. So the idea is, if there's a community, it's a bunch of individuals who have come together. And so that, yeah. Right, that's right. I think it has to, if you think about, for instance, all that's going on in Germany now with circumcision, that's exactly the issue there, which is, do parents have the right to have their children not choose? And I think that's, the claim that this is a violence to the child. I'm not making an argument about this, but I'm saying that the claim to the violence, it's a violence to the child, is premised on the idea that there is no unchosen choice. And I think that's the real, in my opinion, one of the really difficult issues with particularity of communities, and not just a bunch of individuals. But yes. Right. I think the idea of a truly independent individual is a fiction, and I think that's part of what plays out here in these discussions. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.